This is a production of Cornell University.
All right, thank you. I'm Alan Young. I am here today with AJY Consulting. I was asked to provide an overview on the water withdrawal permit as I have been participating both as Alan Young of AJY Consulting and Alan Young of Erie County Soil and Water Conservation District on this for the last 6 or 7 months. I have tried to speak just about everywhere that I can, trying to get into this, and I hope to provide you guys with the information that you need to start making some decisions on your farm here shortly, as you have until the end of the month to look at this stuff. All right. So the water withdrawal permit and guidance, as you guys know, we started this conversation way back in 2012, and it has blossomed again. And hopefully I can provide you with more answers and leave you with questions. So if we're ready, we'll just jump into it. So a brief history, in New York State, the regulation of water withdrawal started all the way back in 1905 when New York State decided that all municipal water withdrawals and water distribution systems needed to be registered. Then in 1989, New York State had a committee that was responsible for water quality. In New York State, they turned that authority over to New York State DEC. In 2011, we had a draft of what later became the Water Resources Law. That draft, and I guess you have to understand the context of it, this law was originally crafted in a time when New York State was currently on the fence about the hydrofracking programs that were creeping into New York State out of Pennsylvania. They were large water users, and this was an avenue of control. And essentially what they looked at and proposed in 2012 was expanding New York State DEC's control over water withdrawal across all industries. So in 2012, the Water Resources Law was passed, which then gave New York State DEC the authority to create a program. February 15th, 2012 also happened to be the date under which we were informed that agriculture would fall under this law, and we were required to register our water use to be exempt from the law prior to February 15th, 2012. On April 2013 was the first time that DEC had finalized their regulations for the permit program, which we did not see as part of public comment. We spent quite a bit of effort back in 2012 when the law was being proposed, making comments, but really the comment period for 2013 did not see the push from the industry. And then 3/31/2021, a group of farms across New York State received a letter as part of a desk audit that DEC had done about the water withdrawal permit program. Those farms were all farms that had registered their water use back in 2012, and they had submitted annual reports to DEC that at some point over the previous decade showed that those farms had either increased their use above the regulatory threshold or had increased their capacity beyond what they had reported in 2012, and therefore triggered the threshold to be on the permit. There's a group of, I think New York State DEC had told us that there was a group of something like 40 farms in upstate New York that were outside of the Joint Basin Commissions that they had sent these letters to. In May and in August of 2021, a committee was formed by DEC to help them try to find a reasonable path forward. the results of those committee meetings, I guess, or what led me to speak to you today. In October and November of 2021, DEC held 2 different webinars. The first webinar in October was held primarily for the group of farms that received the letter back in March. And then the other group, the other presentation was really for everybody, although I don't know how widespread the distribution of their outreach effort was. But this is all going to culminate in March 31st, 2022, which is DEC's self-imposed deadline to have all farms that need to be on the permit at least interacting with DEC to be on that permit. So who needs a permit? Non-agricultural facilities are required, basically, if they have the capacity to withdraw 100,000 gallons a day, they require a permit. Agricultural facilities are set up differently under the law. So we have a 2-part system. The first part is you have to meet the threshold capacity, which is that average of 100,000 gallons a day in any 30-day period, or 3 million gallons in any 30-day period. And that's a consecutive 30-day period. DEC created this lovely little flow chart. So you can ask yourself the questions, is my facility in either the Delaware or the Susquehanna River Basin? If it is, then you fall under the jurisdiction of one of the sub-river basin commissions. If you are in Long Island, then you also fall under a different legislative authority. And if not, then you're with the rest of us in New York State, and then do you meet the threshold of 100,000 gallons per day in any 30-day period, or 3 million gallons during any consecutive 30-day period? If the answer to that is yes, then did you report your water use back in 2012? If you did not, then you need to be on the permit. If you did, have you added any increased sources or the capacity to increase your withdrawal? If you did, then you're probably required to be on the permit. In all cases, DEC is referring people to the regional permit administrator. So whatever region you're in, that's the region that you go to. I did some quick math for people so that you could understand, well, 100,000 gallons or 3 million gallons sounds like a lot of water, but it really isn't. So using the rule of thumb, 1 inch of water a week is going to basically yield 0.0833 feet. So 1 acre is 43,560 square feet, which means that for a 1 inch application over an acre, that's 3,630 cubic feet. 3,630 cubic feet is 27,152.4 gallons for a 1 inch application over an acre. Using our threshold for the permit, that's 100,000 gallons divided by the 27,152 gallons per acre, means that you could irrigate 3.68 acres per day and be under the permit threshold. If you want to look at that as a week, you could be irrigating 27.7 or 25.78 acres per week and be under the permit. And if we want to just look at the 3 million gallons, that's 110 acres of irrigation for a month at 1 inch. So exemptions, if you're obviously below the threshold, then you are exempt from the permit system. If you registered your water use back in 2012, you still are required, regardless of whether or not you're below the threshold, you are still required to submit your annual report to DEC. If you never registered back in 2012 and you did not, and you're below the threshold, then you don't necessarily have to make an annual report to DEC. Yeah. if you registered your water use prior to 2012, even if you were over the threshold and you have not added additional sources or increased your capacity, theoretically, you are still exempt. But again, you will need to continue to submit your annual report. If you purchase water through a permitted facility or fall under the jurisdiction of a regional commission, then theoretically you are exempt. And each one of those river basin commissions is going to have its own permitting system that you're going to need to be compliant with. Some quick definitions and where to find things. So this entire program came out of the Water Resources Law. It defines agricultural purposes as farming for crops, plants, vines, trees, and the keeping, grazing, or feeding of livestock for sale or livestock products, and the on-farm processing of crops, livestock, and livestock products. It's important to look at what they used as a definition under the law, and that was that a facility can be a grouping of parcels that are next to each other or under the control of the same business entity or legal responsible party. DEC has moved this definition around, and right now there is no clear regulatory definition other than DEC saying that most of this is going to be evaluated on a case-by-case, site-specific basis. Farms with multiple locations could be considered to be a single facility, or they could be seen as separate entities under the permit. DEC has said that the regional permit administrator will be your advisor on that to determine how that's going to work. We, as the committee, we submitted many comments about their definition and how things could align better to allow farms the flexibility. And what DEC had essentially came back to us with was that they did not want to see people splitting up their operation to basically skirt the permit. So the basic process for getting through the permit system: you need to forecast your water needs well in advance. DEC's position is that no new water source can be used until it's permitted. The permitted facility needs a permit modification to increase capacity or to add additional sources. So DEC expects that when farms have a need for additional water well in advance, they're going to contact DEC and schedule a pre-application consultation at the farm. DEC's plan is that hopefully a meeting with the regional permit administrator will help to skirt any issues that might become complicating factors in trying to get you a permit. So that'll include looking at where you're going to site it. Is it near wetlands, a stream that it might have an impact on? Is it near other people's wells? There's a whole slew of check boxes that they're supposedly going to have on a form so that they can help advise you the best that they can. After you've contacted DEC and had your pre-application meeting, you're going to need to hire you're going to need to hire a licensed engineer in New York State so that they can help you submit the paperwork, as DEC is looking for qualified individuals, and they have named engineers licensed in the state of New York as those qualified individuals to sign off on the reports. I would also suggest that you contact your well driller at the same time to make sure that everybody is on the same page. You're going to need to work with the well driller and your engineer and DEC to plan your pump test, and if needed, your step-down test, and then coordinate SEEKR, which is New York State's version of the environmental compliance stuff, with endangered species. And then you have SHPO, the State Office of Historic Preservation, and looking for culturally sensitive areas that may or may not require investigation before you're allowed to do earth disturbing activity. The permit is seen as the government action that then requires the SHPO investigation if you fall within a shaded gray area. And then you may need additional permits through DEC for stream bank disturbance. And I mean, theoretically, if your site is large enough, you could also fall under the stormwater regulations for the SWIP program. So once you have all of this set, you get to install the well and necessary monitoring wells and other appurtenances. You will complete the 72-hour pump test. You will compile your studies and reports into the application package and submit that to DEC with your permit application and await DEC's decision on whether or not you can or cannot use that well based on its calculated impact, or if you could use that well, but there will be conditions upon your withdrawal. This process looks very similar for surface water withdrawal. Obviously, there will be no 72-hour pump test, but what will happen is your engineer will have to work with DEC to calculate a safe pass-by-flow calculation. That safe pass-by-flow calculation ensures that there is enough water in whatever surface water body you would be withdrawing from so that it does not negatively impact or is not detrimental to the ecology of the water body. And it does not eliminate anybody else's downstream ability to use the water. Renewals permits are only valid for a maximum of 10 years. DEC has indicated that it is unlikely that they will be a lot of 10-year permits. Most of them will probably be more like 5 years. They are similar to the initial application, except for you will not need to repeat the pump test. The facility will need to justify its water use and document all the water-saving technology and improvements that it has made. Modifications, right now, the way that the law and DEC's regulation reads is that changes requiring a permit modification include, but are not limited to, changes in pump capacity, the installation of new pumps, enlargements of conduits, increased reservoir storage, installation of new sources of withdrawal, or changes in the diameter of an existing well. Modifications require the submission of an amended engineer's report and the certification of the new structures. And if we dig a little deeper into the regulation, that includes distribution lines from your system. So theoretically, buried irrigation lines would be seen as part of the facility and the works of the system, and therefore the modification of that system could theoretically fall under the need for a permit modification. Transfers, so there is language in the permit that, you know, if you want to purchase or transfer property and ownership of a water withdrawal system, DEC needs to be notified and approve of said transfer before it happens. Theoretically, if you were a permitted facility, then you would not be allowed to utilize that new water source on that facility until the permit is granted. DEC has said that they would exercise, you know, their enforcement discretion to ensure that this was not a major concern. So the tough questions that DEC needs to answer and why they say that we need to do that 72-hour pump test and the safe pass-by-flow calculation are these 8 questions. DEC has said that in order to answer these questions, this is what they need from farms to be able to answer and justify the granting of a permit. Some of the concerning questions, and I'm not real sure how we go about answering that or having any confidence in it, is that, you know, environmentally sound and economically feasible water conservation measures seems pretty subjective, and we're gonna dig into that a little bit as part of this. And then the adverse, this will result in no significant individual or cumulative adverse impacts on the quantity or quality of water sources and dependent natural resources. I am not sure how we say that we are going to pull water out and it will not have an impact on the quantity of water available. Items of concern and obstacles for implementation and compliance. How is water going to be shared? If we are going to set up in New York State a permitting system that basically looks at the fair and equitable distribution of water, how is that going to be regulated? And the Water Resources Law took this into account, and they recognized that the use of water for municipal and domestic water shall have the priority over all other purposes. But they did recognize agriculture as a publicly beneficial use. So at least in terms of importance, maybe agriculture got a leg up in future conflicts. But as it stands right now, essentially domestic and municipal purposes have the priority. This is probably at some point would be litigated, I would think, just based on the fact that right now New York State operates under the idea of riparian rights, and that we are a shared use state. So no one individual should have use of a resource that would preclude anybody else from using that resource. And if that is a municipal system that precludes the use by all other users for all other purposes, then that doesn't seem to be consistent with how New York State has prioritized water use in the past. Farms are going to need to develop a water use conservation plan. This is going to be a description of your near-term and long-term water conservation use. Are you using, again, this idea of environmentally sound and economically feasible water conservation measures? And what have you done to date, and what do you plan to do in the future? And this is going to require the use of all known, available, and reasonable methods to prevent and control pollution, wastage, and unreasonable disturbance and defilement of the waters of the state. So at some point, we need to consider how the language of this bill will impact farms. As it stands right now, DEC is using a large amount of its regulatory enforcement discretion and seem to think that they are going to be reasonable about this. But if you look at the authority that this is providing them, that in order for them to grant you a permit, you need to tell them all of the things that you have done. And so long as they feel that it is economically feasible that you've installed everything that you could, then you're supposedly fine. But if they decide that they don't like the fact that people aren't using pressure compensating drip tape because it does not have as great of a uniform efficiency to ensure that the same amount of water is being put out across the entire field, well, they could make that a condition of granting you a permit for your irrigation water withdrawals, that you have to use this type of product, or they like this type of valve because it is less wasteful, or that you must recycle backflush water, or anything else that you can ultimately think of that could save water that might not be financially feasible to you right now could be considered that by DEC in the future. Permits can be granted or denied or granted with conditions. So under the authority granted to DEC, they more or less can put forth any condition that they see fit. And as part of this, DEC already has implemented in the regulation that all wells will have a static water elevation gauge, and they should all have flow meters on them. I questioned DEC about this. Right now, DEC says that they are fine using pump runtime for calculating the amount of water being used and creating an estimate, and they would not be implementing the section of the regulation that requires the static water elevation gauge right now. So inspection of wells is going to be, right now DEC is saying that, again, we aren't looking at this, but it is already written into the law, and they have expectations that not only do you have these devices, but the law then states that they expect that they are calibrated every 5 years. So inspection, as part of this permit, DEC has the right to inspect any part of the water withdrawal system. The water withdrawal system, as I mentioned before, is defined as any facility, works, equipment, or infrastructure operated or maintained for the provisions or withdrawal of water, including but not limited to collection, pumping, treatment, transportation, transmission, storage, and distribution facilities and works. And the facility has a definition of any or all of the physical components of a water withdrawal system. So essentially, under this permit, DEC more or less has the right to inspect anything, anywhere on your farm that there is irrigation infrastructure. We'll talk a minute about the pump test. The 72-hour pump test is the same 72-hour pump test that is expected of municipal wells. They are an extremely rigorous test with exacting requirements. They can only be done under certain conditions. We can't be at a high state of groundwater recharge. We can't have excessive precipitation while it's happening. We can't be in a drought. The winter is probably out. There are just tons and tons of conditions under which this test has to be done. We have to shut down the well for 24 hours before the test. We have to spend 72-hour continuous hours pumping. If you don't know what your planned pumping rate is going to be, then you will need to complete a step-down test before doing the 72-hour pump test. There is a requirement of intensive measurements of water elevations at and around the wells and at surface water sources. Up to 3 monitoring wells may need to be installed for your pumping test. So every surface water source within 1,000 feet of the well, which could be a stream, it could be a wetland, it could be your neighbor's pond, you're supposed to be monitoring. The way the items that they include in there for monitoring these things indicate that you would need to install weirs and nesting wells. I was told DEC would be using their regulatory enforcement discretion, and that those things would not be necessary, but the way that it is currently written, they are cited as examples in the permit. If there are any failures during the pump test, then you're probably going to have to repeat that pump test. Surface water withdrawal, I know this is going to hit home for a lot of agricultural facilities. DEC has an expectation that you know of all upstream water withdrawals. And they will need that number to be able to calculate the pass-by volume. The procedure is described in a 60-page document. DEC says that they will be responsible for the completion of that pump test, or for the completion of the pass-by volume calculation. I had a hard time making it through reading that document and understanding and following how that's going to be determined, but essentially what it means to the farm is that we're going to need to install some sort of a staff gauge, whether that's in a pond or a lake or a stream or a river, so that we can accurately look at the volume of the cross-section of water moving through the channel, and we would have basically a number under which, if there isn't X amount of flow in that channel, then we would not be allowed to withdraw water from it. So the financial burden to the farm, as DEC will tell you, there is no cost for agricultural facilities to submit the permit. Engineering costs, so I have worked with a couple of engineers across New York State to come up with what it would cost to have them produce these reports and oversee the pumping test. And right now it's estimated that it's going to be about $20,000. Now there could be some cost efficiencies there if you're a farm that is going to install multiple wells that may be in the same area. Those costs could be shared over those multiple wells, but right now if you're just a farm that's looking to stick in a single well, $20,000 could be the cost from the engineer. The 72-hour pump test is most likely. There are a couple well vendors out there that would provide that test as part of their services, or you're going to have to hire a third party, but we've seen those tests cost $25,000. Then there's the actual cost to drilling the well that you want to use. If it's a high capacity well, you're probably looking at another $20,000. None of the well drillers that I talked to, or the Well Drillers Association, really like to put a fixed number next to anything. But they said that if you were planning a budget number for a high capacity well, $20,000 ought to get you in the ballpark. Then there's the cost of installing the monitoring wells and decommissioning those monitoring wells, $7,500 a piece. The surface water source monitoring costs are so site specific that we just couldn't come up with a reasonable number after looking at several sites and trying to compare them. SHPO phase 1 and 2, if necessary, has been shown through our project work at Soil and Water Conservation Districts at $1,800 to $12,000 per project. So you add this all up, we're talking that this is going to cost someplace for a $20,000 well that we are going to be spending probably a minimum of $60,000 to $80,000. And then there are reoccurring costs that are part of the program. The permit needs renewal every 10 years, and any permit modifications are going to require the expense of hiring an engineer to sign off on those documents that you're going to have to submit. And then failing and abandoned wells, the permit will likely include the closure and cost of that closure for those failing or unused wells. Your well driller is licensed by New York State DEC, just like a business license. Well drillers are obligated under the law and under threat of losing their certificate to operate that they are required to submit a report before drilling a well. The information that they have to provide is who that well is going to be drilled for and where that well is going to be drilled and its intended purpose. They submitted a report after the well is drilled, which includes yield data for that well. And then in order to close a well, DEC expects that they will submit another notice that they are going to close a well, and then they have to submit a follow-up report saying that they actually did close that well. DEC is well informed about where wells are going in, as by law you have to be a certified well driller to drill a well in New York State, and all of those drillers are then obligated to inform DEC about their activities. Under the Water Resources Law, DEC was granted a wide scope of jurisdiction and authority. So if you read that highlighted sentence there, essentially the regulations may establish exemptions from permitting requirements in addition to those exemptions specified in this section. DEC was given a fairly blank slate under which they were allowed to meet and answer those 8 questions that were demanded of them, but other than that, they were provided this exemption. It seems to indicate that they have the ability to create an exemption for agriculture that would extend beyond the 2012. They have not. One place the DEC has cited their regulatory enforcement discretion is that after discussions with the committee and several farms, DEC has come to realize that farms that are reliant, especially livestock farms that are reliant on the water sources that they have, would not be able to take those sources offline for 24 hours before a pump test and for 72 hours after, during that pump test, and then for a period of time to allow that well to return to, its normal static water elevation. So DEC has said that if those farms who are over the threshold and need to be on the permit, they would theoretically exempt the farm from the pump test for those existing water sources installed prior to March 31st, 2022, so long as the farm does not have any complaints that they are impacting a water resource or somebody else's well negatively. DEC has not committed to that action in writing that they would provide that exemption, but that is what they have told us several times. So the equitability problem, most of the questions that were asked during committee meetings and Q&A sessions were not answered, and they were described as they would be addressed on a site-specific case-by-case basis. The issue for that becomes if each region is deciding everything on a case-by-case site-specific basis, how are they ever going to uniformly enforce a law across New York State? We have a very diverse agricultural sector here in New York State. We have diverse geology. We have diverse superficial deposits, bedrock deposits. So it's very hard to understand how, if everything is going to be case by case, how you can be reasonably assured that all of agriculture is being told the same thing across the state. The broad use of enforcement discretion is definitely going to lead to disparity between regions. We have seen this happen time and time again with CAFO permitting and almost every other permit program that DEC operates that has this large use of enforcement discretion. So under the guides of this program, the whole point was to create a system for monitoring and detecting conflict over our water resources. But under this program, the only people who are being monitored and permitted are termed large water users. They are probably in the best position to comply with regulations, whereas the small users, who are the most likely to be impacted by a large water user and in the poorest position to get satisfaction through a court system, are being overlooked by this system. We have brought this to DEC's attention that the reality is, if we are going to operate under an equitable use of the water resources, that we need to operate a system similar to what Pennsylvania and Ohio do, which is that they have a program in place where they monitor. So anybody who wants to extract groundwater resources needs to register their use with whatever the environmental entity is in that state. And if there are conflicts detected, then the regulator works to create a plan to resolve that conflict. The permit does not grant a right to use water, so even if you are permitted and a neighbor moves in and wants to drill a well and share in that water resource, theoretically, or if it's a municipality in this case, they would have a prioritized water use. So even with surface water sources, right? Nobody has the right to exclusive use of that resource. So additional concerns. The permit will require public notification and comment periods. Also, the permit information is subject to freedom of information requests. So every permit modification will be required to have public notice, as will transfers and renewals. All of this information will be out there for people to use, which would also include that water use conservation plan that you need to submit to DEC would also become part of the public record. So New York State is lacking a agricultural engineering service. We have a limited number of agricultural engineers in New York State that are going to be able to respond to this request. These are time-consuming reports, and most of our agricultural engineers are already lined up with lots of project work and aren't going to be able to just drop what they're doing to spend months writing reports about wells and water resources. There are certainly other engineers in New York State that are available to be hired. It is very questionable whether or not they understand agriculture and our need for water well enough to represent us fairly, is the way that I would look at that. The length of time that the process is going to require is something to be seen. How long will it take to transfer a permit, or how long will it take to get through this process? Remember that as a permitted facility, you are not allowed to use that new water source until after you've received your permit modification or your original permit. Is this going to take 3 months to get through? Is it going to take 6 months to get through? How long, depending on when you install that pump, do you have to wait to be able to perform that pump down test? There are a lot of questions up in the air, and this goes back to, again, why I said that, you really, under this permit system, you have to know your water need well in advance. Potentially, emergency sources were another thing that we had brought up. I mean, theoretically, you could have a well just sitting on your property that is not being used. That could then be added to your permit in advance as an emergency source, or you could identify other emergency sources and water needs in the permit. Again, though, generally when emergencies arise, we typically don't have a whole lot of time to spend doing paperwork to get a permit. DEC has said that they could issue an emergency authorization, and that they would be able to extend that, I think, out past, originally it would be 30 days that you would have to use that emergency source and get the system permitted, and they could extend that, I believe, at least once to get you to 60 days and maybe 90. One of the other things that I would question is New York State DEC's resources devoted to the program. How many people have they prioritized are going to be working on this to help us get through this system in a reasonably efficient manner? how much training have they done, and how is enforcement going to be carried out across the state? If you were a farm that chose not to register your water use in 2012, are you going to be getting a letter in the mail because they know that you are over the threshold and unpermitted? I don't know the answer to that question, and I don't know how DEC's going to go about enforcing this rule. DEC's current interpretation of the use of enforcement discretion is likely to change over time. This regulation certainly could be a lot more burdensome than it is right now. And we have not seen what happens in 10 years from now. Using our crystal ball to look forward, that if somebody wanted to, they could definitely use the way that this permit and regulation is written to be much more stringent about the way that this impacts farms, from everything from looking at whether or not they think your water use is reasonable. You use too many gallons per acre, or you must stop using overhead irrigation because we can save more water if we go to drip irrigation. These are things that could become a possibility, and we have seen in other states that they have, especially in water challenge states like California, where you're not allowed to have certain types of shower heads because they use too much water. It's not hard to see that could someday come to New York State and be a nozzle on an irrigation gun versus a shower head. In summary, it's my opinion that the current regulation seems to stand in stark contrast to the description and general lack of information given to the industry in 2011. To quote our ex-governor, this law will enhance the state's ability to manage its water to promote economic growth and address droughts while protecting the environment. And it described it as a balanced program that manages significant water withdrawals across the state and protects New York's farmers and businesses from undue regulatory burdens. I have a feeling that the implementation of this law and permit is going to cause significant harm to New York State agriculture in the form of direct and indirect expenses, regulatory burden, the reduction of growth, and the failure to protect our water resources. Not to mention, it's going to make us even less competitive in New York State as an agricultural sector when competing against neighbors. Questions?
Hey, Alan, Dave Zittel, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
So just because you've been kind of up to date on this, have there been some farms in New York State that have started to talk to their administrators, and what are their experiences as far as, take a farm that kind of knows they're over the threshold? Have they had good luck, bad luck? Are they in process? Are they confused? Are they already seeing the burdensome of the economic impact? Any insight on farmers that have started the process?
So I know there are a couple of farms who received those letters back in March. One of them was already a farm who was conditionally certified under this program. They were conditionally permitted a year ago. But the reason that they had a conditional permit was because they were required to do that pump test, and this farm they can't afford it. Like they have 6 wells, I think, that need to be pump tested, and they flat out can't afford to spend that kind of money on a pump test. I've been working with another 2 farms who are actively working with engineers right now, and those engineers are working to negotiate the components of the 72-hour pump test with DEC. At this point, everything is preliminary. I don't think that there's been anybody who has, filed and done their done their pump test stuff yet. I don't know that anybody has any of their engineering reports done. I haven't seen anybody who has a shiny new permit yet.
Hey, Alan, this is Rick Zimmerman. Question with regard to the March 31st, 2022 deadline. What can you advise us in context to act of good faith? Does this permit have to be all completed by the 31st, or is it a matter of starting the process, demonstrating a good faith effort?
So from what I've been told by DEC, originally their expectation was that that was the completed, permit application. And in order to complete your permit application, you had to have done the pump test and all the other stuff. They have more or less relaxed that to say that as long as you have kind of contacted DEC, that they would consider that you acting in good faith, and they would move forward from there.
Alan, there's some questions in the chat.
Okay, let me see if I can find that now. Okay. To calculate your facility water withdrawal, do you need to combine all sources, or are they treated separately? Example, stream sources. So that is a total withdrawal for your facility. So that would be all of your wells and all of your streams and all of your ponds all added together. And that 100,000 gallons is a total, or the 3 million gallons over the 30-day period. It doesn't matter unless one of those sources happen to be a municipal water source, which is already permitted, under that municipality's permit. That water would be exempt, or any water that you theoretically bought. I mean, I guess if you wanted to truck in water from Mayer Brothers or something, that water is already being permitted for withdrawal under a different system. But any of your water sources, and that would be ponds, lakes, streams, and wells all together. I received a letter on March 31st, 2021, but it does not state whether a permit whether we need a permit or not. Does the letter mean we need a permit? Tony, what I'd tell you to do is I'd tell you to go back and look at what you submitted to them originally in 2012, and then look at all of the recent reports that you have submitted to them and see if the name of any of the sources changed. That's been one of the things that we find a lot, is that, somebody, when they originally submitted it, they called it well 2, or they called it, somebody's pond, and now that might have a different owner, or you might just know it as a different name, or you went through a GAP certification process and you had to give it a real name. It can't be just Tony's Pond anymore. It's got to be, whatever parcel number, pond, or address, it's that pond. And that name change alone could have triggered DEC to see it as they added a water source. So it's not necessarily that you need a permit. What they are asking right now of you is, hey, this looks different than what you submitted in 2012. It looks like you were probably over the threshold, and now it looks like you have new water sources. So, either provide us with the information that says, no, I don't need to be on the permit. These are really the same thing. I just, filled it out differently or incorrectly, which you are so not alone if that happens to be the case, as there were, I don't know, I'd venture to guess that maybe 15 to 20% of the reporting that is done yearly is done correctly, on the right form with the right numbers from the right places. And this is just a product of, we were given a system in very short notice, people threw things together, and now they've just continued to run with that information, and they've had very little outreach or education over the last decade for this program.
Okay, appreciate it. I think that's what happened to us in the beginning. We have the wrong, looks like we increased our threshold, which we haven't. We've actually gotten smaller. So, and we included public water sources. So
I'm telling you, this was part of the whole deal, was that we really were not provided the education and the guidance component that we needed to make a real effort. I mean, I think 90% of everybody out there probably acted in good faith and did the best that they could with the limited information they had. And again, we see this as I'm sitting here talking to you today,
mhm.
not the regulator.
So I should probably go into my regional administrator and just bring all this in and just
Yeah, give
show
them a call.
give them a call and yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you want to hash this out, and it's better to know now, I guess.
Right.
I don't believe that long term that this program is sustainable for New York State agriculture with the cost that we're going to incur. Like you might be below the threshold right now, but again, the intent and the purpose of this was that we were going to be able to monitor and understand the scope of the water resources used in New York State, and the only people we're looking at right now use 100,000 gallons a day. How long before we need to know about all the people that are using less than 100,000 gallons a day?
Right. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions out there?
Yeah, Alan, this is Dan Henry. A couple of questions or clarifications. So on the 72-hour pump test, am I hearing you right that actually needs to be done on existing wells, not just new wells that are potentially to be drilled in the future?
So if that depends on where you pull your information from. If you go and look at the regulation, yes, that expectation would be for existing wells. What DEC has said is that they are going to use their regulatory enforcement discretion to say that if you have a pre-existing well that you are reliant on, and you do not have any official complaints from any neighbors or businesses that you're impacting their ability to use water, DEC has, and you get in contact with them, they are saying that they will exempt you from needing to do the pump test on those existing wells.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. And then my second question, with respect to rented land. So am I correct in that the permit needs to be in the water withdrawer's name, not the landowner's name, correct?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
That would be, so whoever's ultimately using the water is responsible for having it under their permit.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So then if I were to, I don't know, say have the opportunity to rent some additional land in a given year, and there's a pond or a water source on that property, and I want to try to plant that particular piece of ground this upcoming season, would you think that would fall under the emergency use thing, or are we're gonna have to just wait to get that water source for that particular property added on to our existing permit once we have it, and just wait for however long that process is going to take before we can start farming that land with a crop that requires irrigation?
It seems very likely that they would say that you need a permit modification to add that additional source.
And we don't know what that time frame is right now.
We do not know how long that would take, and remember, the example that you cited, and I think would be most often the case, is that was a surface water source. So now you're going to need a safe pass-by flow calculation, and theoretically, DC again said that this was a case-by-case site-specific answer when I asked it, but I asked whether or not that implication applies to of making sure that we are meeting the need of the natural resource as well as our irrigation water for that safe pass-by flow calculation. That can apply to a pond, and they will consider the littoral zone of the pond a wetland potentially. So if you have frogs and turtles living in that pond, how much water can you withdraw and keep them alive became the question, and that went unanswered. But I think from your standpoint, if you're over the threshold and you want to go pull water out of that pond, then yes, they're absolutely going to expect you to add that to your permit.
Thank you.
Yep.
Alan, Dave Zuttle again. The regional administrator, can I safely assume that once you contact them, if you've received letters, you're probably in the bag anyhow. Once you reach out to that person, I'm guessing you have started the process. Is that correct?
I'd also like to think so, Dave, but right now, there is nothing defined in the, in the agency or the regulation that they've put in black and white that says yes. That was kind of what people hinted at, was that, so long as you've tried to reach out and start this process, that they would consider that started. But I have no guarantees of that, and they certainly have not put anything out in writing on that.
The second part to that question, you kind of described it, I think, pretty well, that New York State is not equipped right now with the amount of professional engineers that even necessarily know all the ins and outs and all the questions to be asked and all the answers that need to be had. But how well equipped are the regional administrators to be giving us the guidance that we need to know, should we move forward, should we move sideways, on how we're, approaching this whole thing if we start putting our foot in?
Great question, Dave. So what I can tell you is the answer that I heard at the second public information meeting that they had, the webinar. That question was brought up at the end in a short Q&A session where people asked, what is the status and the training, and how are these people, going to be educated to make these decisions and answer these case-by-case site-specific questions. And what the engineer for this division of DEC had said was that pretty much there had been no formal training, and this was back in November, that they had not done any formal training to the regional permit administrators as of yet, and that they would see this as a regional permit administrators would work with the state office through DEC in a learn-as-you-go system.
Okay, that pretty much answers it, I think. And last question, based on your calculations at the very beginning, again, every agricultural sector is different. The crops we grow are different. The type of soils that we have are different. But in general, speaking from the vegetable side of things, are we not pretty much including everybody that grows 50 acres of fresh fruits and vegetables or more?
Chances are, yes, we are.
Okay.
I mean, honestly, and this overhead irrigation rule of thumb that I have here isn't my rule of thumb. This is the rule of thumb that I've heard from half a dozen farmers, that you need about an inch of water a week, and if that's the case, then anybody who's growing more than 25 acres of irrigated crops probably falls under this. I mean, but there are some changes there. Drip irrigation and plastic mulch can do wonderful things for ET rates, and maybe we can expand that a little bit more. But at the end of the day, most commercial growers are going to be big enough that they probably reach the threshold.
So we're probably talking hundreds, if not thousands, of people if everybody's going to follow the rule.
Right. Yes. I mean, the Vegetable Growers Association, I think, has better handle on how many of you there are out there in New York State than I would. But I would certainly guess that it's a lot more than the 40 farms that were sent letters.
Thank you, Alan.
Yep.
I'm going to put a sign out survey. If you're leaving and not staying for our annual meeting, please sign out in the survey. If you're staying, you can sign out at the end. And if there's any other questions or anything, please let me know.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.